This is our soil management presentation for the agroecology class. Biomass is lost through harvest and decomposition as we raise our crops, and we need to maintain or restore organic matter in the soil. And we can do that with crop residue. For example, you can see the corn stover that was left in the field after the grain was harvested. Cover crops. We've discussed different types of cover crops that can add organic matter and even add nitrogen to the soil. Animal manure, which can be added raw or it can be composted first. And even human manure, which is sewage sludge if it's properly treated. We also need to diversify our crops in order to increase organic matter in the soil. And that may be different types of crops, intercropping or crop rotation. It can also be non-crops, like cover crops or like shade trees. We also need to increase the below-ground diversity of microbes and soil biota. In order to reduce or to maintain organic matter in the soil, we do need to reduce tillage. And that can be by using no-till or some other methods that we'll discuss. First, we do need to discuss what tillage is. And intensive tillage does involve heavy plowing, disking, and then cultivation, which is controlling the weeds. We can reduce tillage in a number of ways. For example, ridge tillage, where the beds are formed and they're formed into ridges, and then just the top of the ridge is tilled. We can also practice more no-till. Historical example of no-till is actually slash and burn, which has been practiced in the tropics for a long time, and it is a no-till practice that works as long as there's a long fallow period. But we haven't been able to keep long fallow periods as population has increased. So we can look at ways to cultivate the seed bed only, and actually sometimes herbicides are used, but we know that there's concerns about that, so we're looking at other methods. Permanent agriculture is another way to avoid tillage, and so that means using perennials that come back every year and don't have to be replanted. It also means pasture, which you don't have to replant, or trees are not cultivated. The purposes of tillage is to allow the roots of the crop to be able to grow and to incorporate organic matter and also to control weeds. Primary tillage is plowing, and that's when you cut the sod, the grass, when you cut it loose and you invert the soil. And here you can see an image of a moldboard plow, and the sod is cut and it's actually flipped over. It's completely inverted. The other main type of tillage is a secondary tillage that prepares the seed bed, and that includes disking, harrowing, and shaping the beds. And actually what you're trying to do with tillage is reduce the size of the soil particles. You're trying to granulate the soil to be able to allow the roots to grow and incorporate organic matter. Weeding is another type of cultivation, and there's lots of different implements that you can use for weeding. This one does show a sweep type weeder. So I think it's helpful to take a closer look at what these different functions are. Plowing, you can see a moldboard plow here. It does invert the soil. Disking takes a lot of these clods and it chops them up and incorporates them into the soil. Harrowing or harrowing, this is like raking. It's a way to smooth out the seed bed. And you can also shape beds. But these are the main different actions that we see in tillage. Rototilling is another type of action, and this is basically when you beat the soil, and it is hard on the soil. Let's take a look at the moldboard plow. That's what we're going to see in the image here with the tractor. You can see how the soil is flipped over. Here's the sod over here, and the moldboard plow actually flips it over. Let's take a look at a chisel plow now. A chisel plow is a way to plow the subsoil, to aerate it without inverting the soil. And you can see, people often call them rippers. You can see the rippers going into the soil, and it also aerates the soil, but it does not invert it. So it is generally considered a more sustainable way to plow instead of the moldboard plow. Another type of plow is the disc plow. And the disc plow is also considered to be generally more sustainable because it still inverts the soil, but it doesn't invert it completely. Let's actually listen into this speaker for a few minutes.
Great job in the field. It really peels the soil back and flips it over. And the purpose of this is really twofold. One, to break up the ground way deep down in the soil, and secondly, to take all of the foliage that's on top, all the grass and weeds and brush and things that are on the top of the ground, and flip them over down to the bottom of the ground where they can decompose and become organic matter and feed the plants as we get toward planting the seeds here in just a little while in the spring. So you really start the whole process with plowing, and this is the perfect tool for it in this part of the country, and this is what we use here at Redfield Organics to break up the soil and get it ready to plant. So let's take a look and see how it works in the field. We'll run a few rounds and let you see. All right, let's get started.
You can see how the disc plow is another way to invert the soil, but again, it doesn't invert it as completely. It still, there's a lot of the sod that's still on top, and that's why it's considered generally more sustainable than the moldboard plow. Let's take a look at disking.
This is a nice big heavy disc. We like to get a good preparation on the field with a disc. Now, a lot of people are into residue planting and they worry about roughage in the field. We harvest all of our residue and put it right back into the ground to build tilth. Standing residue is not of concern to the Chimney Rock Farm because we have so much water. That sounds excessive, but it's not. Standing residue planting and farming is a technique that harvests water and preserves it. We don't need that here, so we grind it in and use it to build tilth.
The process of rototilling the soil. So we've prepared the soil already by taking off the unwanted foliage, the grass and the weeds that we don't want, and then we've pickaxed to a surface of to a level about 6 or 8 inches deep. The reason we do the rototilling after we've done the pickaxing is we want to really ensure that we're getting 6 or 8 inches below ground surface level. And so that we've got big chunks of soil, and now we're going to rototill. We did the pickaxing so that makes it easier, and the rototiller can do a better job of actually mincing up. It sort of liquefies the soil and bring the roots of the unwanted material in the ground. It's going to sort of make that rise to the top, and it just makes the soil much easier to deal with rather than these big chunks from the pickaxing. I'm Mike Georgia, I'm the rototiller.
So we also saw rototilling in the last video, and then we saw what a disker looks like. So keep in mind there's a difference between the disc, a large disc being used for plowing, and then the smaller disc being used for disking and chopping up the big clods of soil. So the way we use tillage tools on a small scale with a raised bed is we use a shovel if we need to turn the soil over. We also use a broad fork or a garden fork. This is a smaller garden fork compared to a broad fork to aerate the soil. And then we use a rake for harrowing to smooth out the seed bed. We can use a hoe for controlling weeds or cultivation. So this is what we use on a small scale. On a medium scale, people often use a walk-behind tractor. For example, here's a BCS walk-behind tractor with a rototiller implement on it. Again, rototilling is hard on the soil, so you avoid using a lot of rototilling. Although we do use it quite a bit at the SD farm. It is something that prepares a nice seed bed, and we try not to do too many passes with a rototiller. For large scale, obviously you can use a tractor like we've seen images of to plow or chisel, disc, shape your bed, smooth out the seed bed, harrowing. You can use draft animals also. I think it's important to ask how we can mechanize ag sustainably. We do have a lot of food to produce around the world, so this is something that we do need to consider. And I think ways to think about it are modeling agriculture on nature in order to reduce the amount of tillage that we have to do and reduce energy inputs, keeping in mind that tillage reduces organic matter. We also do need to look at sources of renewable energy, and it may be biodiesel, it may be electric, but we have to look at alternatives to fossil fuel. And then when you're using heavy machinery in the field, however it's powered, you have to be careful to reduce compaction. And that means don't put the tractor in the field when it's wet, and especially if it's clay soil. And then you can also use driving patterns in the field where you stay in specific ruts, and you have beds, and then you have your wheel ruts, and you stay in the same ruts, and that reduces compaction throughout the field. That's our presentation for soil management.